My daughter inherited millions from my late husband and left me with only an abandoned house. My name is Margaret, and I'm about to tell you the most unbelievable story of my life. At 56, I thought I knew exactly how my future would unfold after my husband Robert passed away. We'd been married for 32 years, raised our daughter together, and I assumed his will would simply leave everything to both of us equally. How wrong I was. The morning of the will reading, I sat in Lawyer Harrison's sterile office, my hands folded neatly in my lap. My daughter sat beside me, checking her phone with that familiar air of impatience she'd developed over the years. I remember thinking how beautiful she looked in her designer dress, the one I'd helped her pick out for her promotion last year. "Mrs. Coleman," Mr. Harrison began, adjusting his glasses as he opened the thick manila folder. "Your husband's will is quite specific about his intentions." His voice carried an odd tone that made my stomach flutter with unease. He cleared his throat and began reading. "To my beloved daughter, I leave the family home at 342 Maple Street, along with all furnishings, vehicles, and the sum of $6 million from my investment portfolio." I felt my daughter straighten beside me, a sharp intake of breath escaping her lips. $6 million? I had no idea Robert had accumulated so much wealth. My heart raced with excitement, imagining how we'd manage such a windfall together. But then Mr. Harrison continued, and his words hit me like ice water. "To my wife, Margaret, I leave the cabin property on Pine Ridge Road, along with the surrounding 12 acres of land." The room fell silent except for the tick of the grandfather clock in the corner. I stared at Mr. Harrison, waiting for him to continue, to mention my share of the money, the house, something more substantial. But he simply folded the document and looked at me with what I can only describe as pity. That's it?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. My daughter was already calculating on her phone, probably figuring out investment strategies. She didn't even glance in my direction as Mr. Harrison nodded solemnly. "The cabin has been in your husband's family for generations, Mrs. Coleman. According to his notes, he believed you would appreciate its historical significance." Historical significance? The place had been abandoned for 15 years. No electricity, no running water, half the roof caved in from a storm 3 winters ago. Robert and I used to joke about tearing it down someday. As we left the office, my daughter finally spoke. "Well, Mom, I guess you'll need to find somewhere else to live. I'll be moving into the house next month." Her voice was casual, like she was discussing the weather. That night, alone in what I still considered my home, I stared at the faded photo of Robert on our nightstand. 32 years of marriage, and this was his final message to me? A broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere while our daughter inherited everything else? I had no idea that this devastating moment would become the first step toward discovering strengths I never knew I possessed. 2 weeks later, I was packing my entire life into cardboard boxes when my daughter walked through the front door with a contractor and an interior designer. She didn't knock. After all, it was her house now. "Mom, you're still here?" she said, not bothering to hide her irritation. "I told you I needed you out by today." I looked up from the box of photo albums I was carefully wrapping. "Sweetheart, I just need a few more days. I haven't even been able to get the utilities turned on at the cabin yet, and that's not my problem." Her voice was sharp, cold in a way I'd never heard before. "I have contractors coming to renovate this entire place. The designer needs measurements." The young woman beside her, barely older than my daughter, was already pulling out a tablet and measuring tape. They discussed knocking down walls and installing marble countertops as if I weren't standing right there. "But honey, where am I supposed to go tonight? The cabin doesn't even have electricity." She finally looked directly at me, and what I saw in her eyes broke something inside my chest. There was no warmth, no recognition of the woman who had rocked her through countless nights of fever, who had saved for months to buy her first car, who had believed in every dream she'd ever shared. "Figure it out, Mom. You're a grown woman." I spent that night in my car in the driveway of what used to be my home, watching through the windows as strangers measured my kitchen for demolition. The next morning, she had the locks changed. The drive to Pine Ridge Road took 40 minutes through winding mountain roads. With each mile, civilization seemed to fall away behind me. No cell towers, no convenience stores, just endless trees and the sound of gravel crunching under my tires. The cabin sat in a small clearing, looking even worse than I remembered. The front porch sagged dangerously to one side. Several windows were boarded up, and weeds had grown so tall they nearly reached the eaves. This was what my husband had left me, this monument to abandonment. I sat in my car for a long time, engine running, heat blasting against the October chill. Part of me wanted to drive straight back to town, find a cheap motel, maybe call my sister in Arizona. But another part of me, a part I barely recognized, felt something I hadn't expected. Anger. Not the helpless, bewildered hurt I'd been carrying since the will reading, but genuine anger. How dare she treat me like a stranger? How dare she throw away 32 years of love and sacrifice as if they meant nothing? I turned off the engine and grabbed the first box from my back seat. If this was where life had brought me, then this was where I'd make my stand. The front door stuck, warped from years of weather, but I threw my shoulder against it until it gave way. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through broken boards. The air smelled of mildew and mouse droppings, but as I stood there in that ruined space, something shifted inside me. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was completely alone with my own thoughts. No husband to defer to, no daughter to accommodate, no social expectations to meet. Just me, Margaret Coleman, and whatever strength I could find in these forgotten walls. The first night nearly broke me. Without electricity, darkness fell like a heavy curtain by 6 o'clock. I'd brought camping supplies from the garage, Robert's old Coleman lantern, sleeping bags that smelled of mothballs, and a camp stove that took me 20 minutes to figure out. I heated a can of soup over the tiny flame, my hands shaking from cold and exhaustion. The temperature had dropped to near freezing, and my breath formed small clouds in the lantern light. Every sound seemed amplified. Branches scraping against the roof, something scurrying in the walls, the settling groans of old wood. But I didn't leave. Something stubborn in me refused to give up, to crawl back to town defeated and ask for help from people who would whisper about the poor woman whose own daughter had thrown her out. By the third day, I'd developed a routine. Up at dawn to assess what needed fixing, afternoons spent clearing debris and making basic repairs with tools I found in a rusted shed behind the cabin. I learned to prime the old hand pump until rusty water finally flowed, to stack firewood efficiently to identify which parts of the roof leaked worst when it rained. My hands, once soft from years of office work and social lunches, developed calluses. My back ached constantly, but it was an honest ache from real work. I'd lost 8 pounds in 2 weeks, and my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror showed a woman I barely recognized, leaner, harder somehow, with eyes that held a new kind of determination. The isolation was both blessing and curse. Days passed without hearing another human voice, but I found myself talking to the squirrels that raided my small garden, to the old oak tree that shaded the cabin's east side, even to Robert's memory when the loneliness became overwhelming. "What were you thinking?" I asked his photo one evening, propped against the lantern as I ate another can of beans. "Was this some kind of test? Did you think I was too soft? Too dependent?" But slowly, grudgingly, I began to understand something I'd never realized before. I was capable of far more than I'd ever imagined. The helpless wife who couldn't change a light bulb without calling her husband was discovering she could repair a roof, fix a broken step, and yes, even survive alone in the woods. My daughter called once, 3 weeks after she'd had me locked out. I was outside chopping firewood when I heard my phone ringing from inside the cabin. "Mom? I just wanted to check that you're not dead or anything." Her voice carried that same casual indifference. "I'm fine," I said, surprising myself with how steady I sounded. "Good. Listen, I'm having a housewarming party next weekend. I thought about inviting you, but honestly, it's going to be mostly my friends and some business contacts. You probably wouldn't enjoy it." I almost laughed. A month ago, that would have devastated me. Now it barely stung. "You're probably right. Okay, well, take care of yourself, I guess." After she hung up, I stood there holding the phone, realizing something remarkable had happened. For the first time in my adult life, someone's rejection of me hadn't sent me into desperate attempts to win them back. Instead, I felt free. That night, I built the biggest fire I'd managed yet, and sat watching sparks rise toward the star-filled sky, thinking about the woman I was becoming in this forgotten place. The first sign something was wrong came when my sister stopped returning my calls. We'd talked every Sunday for 15 years, sharing everything from recipe disasters to relationship advice. Suddenly, silence. Then Mrs. Patterson from church crossed the street to avoid me when I made my monthly trip to town for supplies. We'd served together on the charity committee for a decade. But she looked right through me, as if I were invisible. It wasn't until I ran into my neighbor Carol at the grocery store that I understood what was happening. She approached me hesitantly, glancing around as if checking for witnesses. "Margaret? Honey, I just want you to know that I don't believe a word of it," she whispered, grabbing my arm with urgent familiarity. "Believe what?" I asked, genuinely confused. Carol's face crumpled with sympathy. "What she's been telling everyone. about how you demanded half of everything, how you threatened to contest the will, how you called Robert terrible names at the funeral. We all know you loved that man with your whole heart. The blood drained from my face. She said I did what? There's more, Carol continued, her voice dropping even lower. She's telling people you stole jewelry from the house, that you've been calling her at all hours making threats, that you showed up drunk to her workplace causing a scene. Margaret, everyone's talking about it. I felt physically ill. My own daughter was systematically destroying my reputation, turning 30 years of friendships and community connections into weapons against me. But why would she? I think she's trying to make sure no one takes your side if you do decide to fight the will, Carol said sadly. She's protecting her inheritance by making you look crazy and vindictive. Over the following weeks, the full extent of her campaign became clear. My book club stopped calling about meetings. The charity committee replaced me without explanation. Old friends turned away when they saw me, their faces set with judgment and disappointment. She'd even reached my extended family. My brother in Texas sent a brief cold email saying he was disappointed in my behavior during this difficult time, and thought it best if we took a break from communication. My nephew, who'd always sent birthday cards, blocked me on social media. The cruelest blow came when I learned she'd told people I'd been abusive to Robert during his final illness. The woman who'd spent countless nights in the hospital, who'd learned to give injections and manage medications, who'd held his hand through every treatment, now painted as a neglectful, selfish wife who'd made his last months miserable. I found myself completely alone, not just physically in the cabin, but socially erased from every relationship I'd built over decades. She'd crafted the perfect prison, isolation so complete that even if I tried to tell my side of the story, who would listen? But here's what she hadn't counted on. Being stripped of everything external forced me to look inward. Without the constant noise of social obligations and others' expectations, I began hearing my own voice more clearly than I had in years. Late at night by the fire, I'd think about the woman everyone now believed me to be versus the woman I actually was. The gap between reputation and reality had never been wider, and strangely, it was liberating. If I was going to be alone anyway, if my name was already mud in every circle that had once welcomed me, then I had nothing left to lose. And a woman with nothing to lose, I was learning, is a dangerous creature indeed. I began to understand that my daughter's lies weren't just cruel, they were strategic. She wasn't just protecting her inheritance. She was ensuring I'd have nowhere to turn for support if I ever found a way to challenge what had happened. What she couldn't know was that she was creating exactly the conditions I needed to become someone entirely new. 2 months into my exile, I'd cleared most of the debris from inside the cabin. What had once seemed like an impossible task was now nearly complete, testament to what desperate determination could accomplish. I'd developed muscles I'd forgotten I had, and a confidence in my own capabilities that surprised me daily. It was while cleaning out the back room, originally meant as a pantry, that I made the discovery that would change everything. I was pulling apart a stack of rotting wooden crates when I heard something metallic hit the floor with a distinctive clink. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary old-fashioned key, the kind you might find at an antique shop. But as I cleaned away decades of grime and rust, intricate details emerged. The shaft was longer than normal keys, and the head bore symbols I didn't recognize. A compass rose intertwined with what looked like mountain peaks, and tiny letters so worn I couldn't make them out clearly. The metal felt heavier than it should have, and there was something about the craftsmanship that suggested this wasn't mass-produced. Someone had taken great care in creating this key, making it both functional and meaningful. I spent the evening examining it by lamplight, running my fingers over the engravings, trying to decipher their meaning. The compass rose pointed in 8 directions, and each point seemed to have a tiny symbol etched beside it. One looked like a tree, another like a house, a third resembling crossed pickaxes. The pickaxes caught my attention. This area had been mining country a century ago, silver and copper mostly, though those operations had shut down long before Robert and I ever visited the cabin. Could this key be related to some old mining claim? But what really intrigued me was where I'd found it. The crates had been stacked against what I'd assumed was the back wall, but now I could see that the wall boards were different from the others, newer, or at least replaced at some point, and they didn't quite line up perfectly with the ceiling joists. I spent the next day examining every inch of that wall, running my hands along the boards, looking for any sign of what this key might open. Nothing seemed obvious, but something nagged at me. Why would someone hide a key so carefully if there wasn't something important to unlock? That evening, I sat by the fire holding the key, studying it from every angle. The weight of it seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite hear. Robert had grown up visiting this cabin with his grandfather, but he'd never mentioned anything mysterious about it. Then again, Robert had never mentioned having $6 million either. A terrible thought occurred to me. What if my husband's strange will wasn't the act of a man who'd grown cold toward his wife, but rather the carefully planned move of someone who knew something I didn't? What if the cabin wasn't a consolation prize or an insult, but actually the most valuable part of his estate? I held the key up to the lamplight, watching the engravings catch and reflect the flame. Tomorrow, I decided, I would start looking more systematically. If this key unlocked something on this property, I was going to find it. For the first time since that awful day in the lawyer's office, I felt something I'd almost forgotten: hope. Not the desperate hope of someone drowning and grasping for rescue, but the steady hope of someone who senses they're finally asking the right questions. The key seemed to warm in my palm as I closed my fist around it, and I had the strangest feeling that my real inheritance was just beginning to reveal itself. It took me 3 days of methodical searching before I found what the key opened. I'd examined every door, every drawer, every cabinet in the cabin. I'd checked outbuildings, fence posts, even old tree stumps. Nothing. It was pure accident that led to the discovery. I dropped my flashlight while moving a heavy wooden chest, and as I crawled under the floor to retrieve it, my hand pressed against what felt like a metal plate embedded in the foundation stones. Heart pounding, I brought the lantern down for a closer look. There, almost invisible beneath decades of dust and spider webs, was a small metal door built into the stone foundation itself, and at its center was a keyhole that perfectly matched my mysterious key. The lock was stiff from disuse, but the key turned with surprising smoothness. The small door swung open, revealing a cavity that extended deeper into the earth than my light could reach. I had to enlarge the opening by removing several loose stones before I could squeeze through. What I found took my breath away. The cavity opened into a small underground room, clearly excavated by hand decades ago, and it was filled with carefully preserved documents, maps, and a wooden chest that seemed to pulse with possibility in the lamplight. The papers were wrapped in oiled cloth and organized with meticulous care. Property deeds, geological surveys, mining claims, and correspondence dating back 50 years. But it was the letter addressed to me in Robert's familiar handwriting that made my hands tremble as I opened it. "My dearest Margaret," it began. "If you're reading this, then you found the key and had the courage to follow where it led. I knew my strong, brilliant wife would figure it out, even if it took time." The letter went on to explain everything. Robert's grandfather hadn't just owned the cabin, he'd owned the mineral rights to nearly 2,000 acres of surrounding land. Rights that Robert had inherited and quietly maintained for decades without ever mentioning them to anyone, including me. "I couldn't risk anyone knowing while I was alive," he continued. "Not even you, my love. Too many people watching, too many questions about why I'd leave everything to you. But the geological surveys in this box will show you what I discovered 3 years ago." My hands shook as I unfolded the professional reports. The land beneath and around the cabin contained significant deposits of garnets, amethyst, and other semi-precious stones. Conservative estimates suggested extraction rights worth between $8 and $12 million. But the most shocking revelation came in the final paragraph of Robert's letter. "I know this seems cruel, leaving you with what appears to be so little while giving our daughter so much. But you, my dear one, have always been the stronger of us. She has been given enough money to learn hard lessons about responsibility and values. You have been given the tools to build whatever life you choose. I pray someday you'll both understand that I loved you enough to give you what you each needed most." I sat in that hidden room for hours, absorbing the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My husband hadn't abandoned me. He'd entrusted me with wealth beyond anything our daughter had inherited. More than that, he'd believed I had the strength and wisdom to handle it properly. The wooden chest contained more treasures, samples of the stones found on the property, contact information for mining companies, and detailed maps showing the most promising extraction sites. Everything I needed to transform my inheritance from an apparent punishment into genuine fortune. But perhaps the most valuable thing in that underground vault was the restoration of my faith in the man I'd loved for 32 years. He hadn't grown cold or dismissive. He'd made a calculated gamble that I would be strong enough to uncover the truth and wise enough to use it well. As I climbed back up into the cabin, documents carefully rewrapped and secured, I felt like I was emerging from more than just a hole in the ground. I was emerging from months of doubt, hurt, and self-pity into something far more powerful. My daughter thought she'd won everything. She had no idea the game had only just begun. The next morning, I drove to the nearest town with a library and internet access. Armed with the geological surveys and mining company contacts Robert had left me, what I discovered over the following days exceeded even my husband's optimistic projections. The gemstone market had exploded in the 3 years since his surveys were completed. Semi-precious stones were in unprecedented demand for both jewelry and industrial applications. The conservative 8 to 12 million estimate now looked more like 15 to 20 million, possibly more depending on extraction methods and market timing. I spent hours on the phone with mining consultants, careful to reveal nothing about my location or identity. I learned about lease agreements, extraction rights, environmental permits, and revenue sharing. Most importantly, I discovered that I could maintain complete control over any operations while receiving substantial upfront payments just for exploration rights. But I also learned something else. Patience would multiply my profits exponentially. The smart play wasn't to cash out immediately, but to secure preliminary contracts with major companies and let them compete for full rights. Market projections suggested values could double again within 5 years. For now, I had a more immediate concern. My daughter's $6 million wouldn't last forever, especially given what I'd started hearing about her spending habits. Carol had filled me in during my last supply run to town. The renovation of my old house had cost nearly $500,000, marble everything, imported fixtures, designer furniture. My daughter had also bought herself a luxury SUV, taken 2 European vacations, and was reportedly looking at investment properties in the city. She's living like someone with $50 million, not 6, Carol had whispered. And from what I hear, she's gotten involved with some man who's encouraging the spending. Claims he's a financial advisor, but nobody's seen any credentials. I filed this information away, neither pleased nor distressed by it. My daughter was an adult making her own choices, but I was curious to see how long her inheritance would sustain the lifestyle she'd chosen. Meanwhile, I was living on less than $1,000 a month, growing my own vegetables, heating with wood I cut myself, and discovering that I'd never been happier or more at peace. The irony wasn't lost on me. The daughter with millions was stressed about money and status, while the mother living in poverty had never felt more secure. I'd signed preliminary agreements with 3 different mining companies, each offering substantial sums just for the right to conduct detailed surveys. The lowest offer was for $2 million upfront, with revenue sharing that could reach 8 figures over the next decade. I hadn't accepted any offers yet, preferring to watch the market and let demand build. But I'd also done something else. I'd quietly purchased additional land adjacent to my property. The mineral rights extended beyond the original cabin lot, and I discovered that several neighboring parcels were owned by elderly couples ready to retire somewhere warmer. They were happy to sell to the poor woman living in that old cabin for far below market value. By spring, I owned nearly 1,500 acres of prime mining territory, all acquired for less than the cost of my daughter's kitchen renovation. Every evening, I'd sit by my fire reading geology reports and market analyses by lamplight, occasionally chuckling at how absurd my life had become. 6 months ago, I'd been a suburban housewife whose biggest decision was what to serve at dinner parties. Now I was negotiating million-dollar contracts and quietly assembling one of the most valuable private mining claims in the state. The best part? Nobody suspected a thing. To the outside world, I was still just the crazy woman whose own daughter had thrown her out, living in poverty in a broken-down cabin. The perfect camouflage for building an empire in secret. I was learning that true power often looks like weakness to people who only understand the surface of things. From my quiet perch in the mountains, I watched my daughter's world unravel with the steady inevitability of a Greek tragedy. Carol had become my unwitting intelligence source, updating me on the town gossip during my monthly supply runs. "That boyfriend of hers is bad news," she confided over coffee at the diner. "Paul something or other claims he's some hotshot investment advisor from the city, but his car's been repossessed twice, and he's been kicked out of his apartment." The pattern became clear over the following months. Paul had convinced my daughter to invest heavily in cryptocurrency and day trading. He'd also encouraged her to buy a second property, a vacation rental that was supposed to generate passive income, but instead became a money pit when the tourism market collapsed. "She's been trying to flip houses, too," Carol continued. "Bought 3 properties in the last 6 months, convinced she could renovate and sell them quickly. But the market's shifted, and she's stuck with massive renovation loans on houses nobody wants to buy." I listened with the detached curiosity of someone watching a documentary about financial disasters. There was no satisfaction in it, just a kind of sad recognition that Robert's lesson was playing out exactly as he'd intended. By winter, the signs of real trouble were visible even from my mountain exile. The luxury SUV had been traded down to a used sedan. The European vacation photos on social media had stopped appearing. Most telling of all, she'd started posting about new business ventures and exciting opportunities. The desperate language of someone scrambling to replace lost income. The final confirmation came when Carol mentioned seeing my daughter at the discount grocery store, arguing with the cashier about coupon policies. This was the same woman who'd been shopping at premium markets and having groceries delivered just months earlier. She looks awful, Margaret. Thin in a bad way, dark circles under her eyes. I almost didn't recognize her. I found myself feeling genuinely sorry for her, which surprised me. The anger and hurt had faded, replaced by something closer to maternal concern. She was learning the hardest lessons possible about money, responsibility, and the people you trust. Part of me wanted to intervene, to save her from the consequences of her choices. But I remembered Robert's letter. She has been given enough money to learn hard lessons about responsibility and values. This was the education he'd purchased for her with $6 million. Perhaps the most expensive and valuable schooling she'd ever receive. Meanwhile, my own situation had taken another positive turn. 2 of the mining companies had completed their preliminary surveys and were now bidding aggressively for extraction rights. The lowest current offer was for $12 million upfront, with projected revenues that could exceed $30 million over the next decade. I was also receiving rental income from the portions of my land that I'd leased for wind energy development. The monthly checks weren't huge, but they covered my modest living expenses several times over. I was accumulating wealth faster than I could spend it, while maintaining the facade of rural poverty. The strangest part was how little my actual daily life had changed. I still woke at dawn, still chopped my own wood, still grew my own vegetables. The knowledge that I could buy anything I wanted somehow made me want less, not more. I'd discovered that freedom wasn't about having unlimited choices, but about choosing what truly mattered. As spring arrived again, I found myself wondering when my daughter's pride would finally break. How far would she fall before reaching out? And when that moment came, what kind of mother would I choose to be? The answer would arrive sooner than I expected, in the form of a desperate phone call on a rainy Thursday evening. The call came at 8:30 on a Thursday evening in late March. I was reading by the fire when my phone rang, a sound so rare in my mountain solitude that it startled me. The caller ID showed my daughter's name, and for a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail. But something in the timing felt different. Urgent. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Mom?" Her voice was barely a whisper, thick with tears and what sounded like genuine desperation. "Mom, are you there?" "I'm here." I kept my voice neutral, neither welcoming nor cold. I need to talk to you. Can I come up there? Please?" The change in her tone was startling. Gone was the dismissive confidence, the casual cruelty that had marked our last conversations. This was the voice of someone who'd reached the end of their rope. "When?" I asked. "Now? I'm already halfway there. I've been driving for an hour, trying to work up the courage to call." 20 minutes later, headlights swept across my windows. I watched from the doorway as she climbed out of an older compact car I didn't recognize, clearly several steps down from the luxury SUV she'd been driving. Even in the lamplight, I could see how much weight she'd lost, how her clothes hung loose on her frame. She stood at the bottom of my porch steps for a long moment, as if gathering strength for what came next. When she finally looked up at me, her face was streaked with tears and exhaustion. "Mom, I'm in trouble. Real trouble." I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she moved with the careful precision of someone trying not to collapse. She sat heavily in the chair across from my fire, staring at her hands folded in her lap. "How much trouble?" I asked, settling back into my own chair. $400,000. The number came out like a confession. That's what I owe between the credit cards, the renovation loans, the investment losses, and the mortgages on the properties I can't sell. I waited for more details, but she seemed to have exhausted herself just admitting the scope of her disaster. "What about Paul?" I asked. Her laugh was bitter. "Paul disappeared when the money did. Turns out his investment strategies were just elaborate ways to gamble with my inheritance. The properties he convinced me to buy are worth half what I paid. The cryptocurrency portfolio is worthless. Even the day trading account is frozen because he was using borrowed money." She looked up at me then, and I saw something I hadn't seen in years. Genuine vulnerability. The arrogant young woman who'd thrown me out of my own home had been replaced by someone who looked lost and broken. "I lost the house, Mom. The beautiful house Dad left me. The bank foreclosed last week. I'm staying in a motel room, and I can't even afford that much longer." "What do you want from me?" I asked gently. "I don't know." She started crying again, great heaving sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside. "I know I have no right to ask you for anything after how I treated you. I know you probably hate me, but I don't have anyone else left. Everyone I thought was a friend disappeared when the money did. I let her cry for several minutes, watching the flames dance in the fireplace while she released months of accumulated fear and shame. When the sobs finally subsided, I handed her a tissue and waited for her to compose herself. I don't hate you, I said quietly. I was hurt and angry, but I never stopped loving you. You're still my daughter. She looked up with something like hope in her swollen eyes. Does that mean you'll help me? That depends, I said, choosing my words carefully. Help you how? I live in a cabin without running water. I grow my own food and cut my own firewood. What kind of help do you think I can offer? I don't know. Maybe I could stay here for a while, just until I figure out what to do next. I could get a job in town, start paying back what I owe. I studied her face in the firelight. She was sincere, I believed that, but sincerity born from desperation wasn't the same as genuine change. Robert's letter had spoken about lessons that needed to be learned. I suspected those lessons weren't complete yet. $400,000, I repeated. That's a lot of debt for someone starting over with minimum wage jobs. I know it's hopeless. But I have to try something. I stood and walked to the window, looking out at the moonlit forest while I considered my options. I could help her financially. God knows I had the means now. But simply paying off her debts would rob her of the very lessons Robert had intended her to learn. I'll make you a deal, I said, turning back to face her. You can stay here while you get back on your feet. I'll even help with your debt. But there are conditions. Anything. I'll do anything. First, you work for it. This property needs maintenance. Improvements, care. You'll work here 4 days a week, doing whatever needs doing. Physical labor, not management or supervision. She nodded eagerly, though I suspected she had no idea what she was agreeing to. Second, you live like I live. No complaints about the accommodations, the food, the lack of conveniences. If you're going to stay in my world, you adapt to my world. Okay, yes. Third, you make a public apology to everyone you lied to about me. You write letters to my family, to the church committee, to anyone whose opinion of me you tried to poison. You tell them the truth about what happened and take full responsibility for your lies. This one made her flinch, but she nodded. Fourth, you get professional help for whatever made you think destroying your mother's reputation was acceptable behavior. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes to understand why you became capable of such cruelty. And if I do all that, she asked quietly, then I'll help you deal with your debt. Not by simply paying it off, but by helping you develop a realistic plan to address it over time. You'll learn to live within your means, to rebuild your credit responsibly, to make better choices. She was quiet for a long time, staring at the fire. I could almost see her weighing her options, realizing how few she actually had. Mom, she said finally, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest. Do you have some way to help that I don't know about? Because living like this... She gestured around the sparse cabin. This doesn't look like you have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spare. I smiled, the first genuine smile I'd felt in months. That's exactly the kind of assumption that got you into trouble in the first place. You see poverty and assume powerlessness, just like you saw your inheritance and assumed it made you untouchable. So you do have money? What I have, I said carefully, is a deeper understanding of what real wealth means than I had a year ago. And if you're serious about changing, if you're willing to do the hard work of becoming someone worthy of help, then yes, I can help you. She nodded slowly, and for the first time since she'd arrived, I saw a glimmer of the daughter I'd raised, the one who used to bring me dandelions and ask thoughtful questions about how the world worked. When do we start? She asked. Tomorrow at dawn. I hope you brought work clothes. The first weeks were harder than either of us expected. My daughter, who hadn't done physical labor since high school PE class, struggled with tasks that had become routine for me. Splitting firewood left her hands blistered and her back aching. Hauling water from the well had her gasping after 10 minutes. But she didn't quit. Every morning at dawn, she appeared ready to work, even when I could see exhaustion written in every line of her face. Why didn't you ever make me do chores like this growing up? She asked one afternoon, taking a break from clearing brush. Because your father and I wanted to give you an easier life than we'd had, I admitted. We thought we were being good parents by protecting you from hardship. You were protecting me from learning anything useful, she said, not unkindly. I had no idea how to actually do anything when I was on my own. Those conversations became a pattern. Working side by side, we started talking about things we'd never discussed before. She told me about the pressure she'd felt to succeed, to live up to some impossible standard she'd created in her own mind. I told her about the loneliness of my marriage, how I'd lost myself in trying to be the perfect wife and mother. "Did you and Dad ever actually talk to each other?" she asked one day as we repaired fence posts. "Not about anything real," I realized. "We talked about schedules, about you, about practical things. But we hadn't had a real conversation about our feelings or dreams in years. I think that's why I trusted Paul so easily," she said. "He was the first person who seemed interested in what I wanted, not just what I could provide." The therapy I'd insisted on was helping her understand patterns that went back years. She was learning to recognize the difference between people who valued her and people who valued what she could give them. Meanwhile, she was keeping her other promises too. The apology letters were difficult to write, but she crafted them carefully, taking full responsibility for her lies without making excuses. My sister was the first to call after receiving hers, crying with relief and begging my forgiveness for doubting me. "I knew something didn't sound right," she sobbed over the phone. "But she was so convincing, and she seemed so hurt by your supposed behavior." One by one, relationships I'd thought were permanently damaged began to heal. The church committee invited me back. Old friends reached out tentatively, then with growing warmth as they realized I harbored no grudges for their earlier rejection. But the most significant healing was happening between my daughter and me. 3 months into our arrangement, she'd developed calluses, gained back healthy weight, and begun sleeping soundly for the first time in years. More importantly, she was learning to find satisfaction in simple accomplishments: a well-built fence, a successful garden harvest, a properly stacked woodpile. "I understand why you like it out here," she said one evening as we sat by the fire. "Everything is exactly what it appears to be. Wood burns or it doesn't. Water flows or it's blocked. Plants grow or they die. There's no pretense, no manipulation, no hidden agendas." "And how does that feel?" "Peaceful," she said, then laughed. 6 months ago, I would have said boring. Now I think it might be the first peace I've felt since college. I'd been gradually revealing more about my true situation, not the full extent of my newfound wealth, but enough to help her understand that I wasn't as helpless as she'd assumed. I'd shown her some of the preliminary mining contracts, explained how mineral rights worked, let her see that her mother was far more capable than anyone had given her credit for. "You've been sitting on a fortune this whole time," she said, not accusingly, but with genuine amazement. "I've been learning what to do with a fortune," I corrected. "There's a difference. Money without wisdom is just a more expensive way to make mistakes." "Is that what Dad was trying to teach us?" "Both of us?" "I think so. You needed to learn that money doesn't solve character problems. I needed to learn that I was stronger and smarter than I'd ever believed." By spring, she'd found work at a local veterinary clinic and was making steady progress on a debt management plan. More importantly, she'd become someone I genuinely enjoyed spending time with: thoughtful, humble, quick to help others, slow to judge. The transformation was so complete that I began to consider whether the final phase of Robert's plan was ready to unfold. 1 year after my daughter's desperate phone call, I decided it was time for the final revelation. She'd proven herself over 4 seasons of hard work, honest conversation, and genuine personal growth. More importantly, she'd learned to find contentment in simple living and meaningful work. I'd accepted the largest mining offer, $18 million upfront with projected revenues exceeding $40 million over the next decade. I'd also quietly purchased a beautiful home on the lake, 30 minutes from town, complete with guest quarters and workshop space. It was time to stop pretending to be poor. "I need to show you something," I told her one Saturday morning as we finished our usual breakfast of eggs from our chickens and vegetables from our garden. Instead of heading to our work projects, I led her to my car. "We're taking a drive." She followed without question, though I could see curiosity building as we drove toward town instead of deeper into the mountains. When I turned into the driveway of the elegant lake house, she looked confused. "Mom, whose house is this? Did you get a caretaking job or something?" I parked in front of the main entrance and turned off the engine. "It's mine." Her face went through several expressions: confusion, disbelief, and finally something approaching shock. "What do you mean?" "It's yours." "I mean, I bought it 3 months ago. I've been having it furnished while waiting for the right time to tell you." I led her through the front door into a beautifully appointed home with picture windows overlooking the lake. The decor was elegant but comfortable, not the ostentatious display of wealth that had characterized her renovation of my old house, but the thoughtful choices of someone who understood the difference between luxury and excess. "I don't understand," she said, standing in the middle of the living room. "How could you possibly afford this?" So I told her everything: the hidden room beneath the cabin, Robert's letter, the geological surveys, the mining rights worth more than her original inheritance had ever been. I showed her the contracts, the geological reports, the bank statements that proved her supposedly destitute mother was actually quite wealthy. She sank into one of the leather chairs, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You've been rich this whole time," she said slowly. "While I was learning to split wood and haul water, while I was working at the vet clinic for $12 an hour, you've been sitting on millions of dollars." For a moment, I wondered if she was angry, if she felt deceived or manipulated. But then she started laughing, not bitter or sarcastic laughter, but genuine amusement. "Dad really did plan this whole thing, didn't he?" "Every bit of it." "I believe so, yes. He knew I'd blow through the money. He knew I'd end up broke and desperate. He knew I'd have to come crawling back to you for help. And he knew I'd need to discover my own strength before I could help you properly." She was quiet for a long time, looking out at the lake. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful, not resentful. "If you just paid off my debts when I first asked, what would I have learned?" "Nothing," I said. "You'd have been grateful temporarily, but you wouldn't have changed. You'd have made the same mistakes again. And if I'd known you were wealthy while we were working on the cabin, you might have worked hard, but you wouldn't have learned to value the work itself. You wouldn't have discovered that you could be happy with less." She nodded slowly. "He was a smart man, wasn't he? Smarter than either of us gave him credit for. He loved us enough to give us what we needed instead of what we wanted." We spent the rest of the day exploring the house and discussing the future. She would continue working at the veterinary clinic because she'd discovered she loved the work. She would also continue living simply, having learned that happiness didn't require luxury. But her debt would be managed and her future would be secure. Most importantly, we'd found our way back to each other. Not as the people we'd been before, but as the people we'd become through loss, struggle, and ultimately, understanding. As for the others in our story, Paul disappeared completely after draining several of my daughter's accounts, presumably to find another wealthy target. The family members who'd turned against me based on lies welcomed me back with genuine remorse and deeper appreciation. Carol became a dear friend who visits regularly, delighting in the ironic twist of my story. My daughter and I now split our time between the lake house and the cabin, both of which we've learned to love for different reasons. She's become an accomplished gardener and carpenter, skills that bring her genuine pride. I've become something I never expected, a successful businesswoman who negotiates mining contracts while still preferring to grow my own tomatoes. The greatest treasure we discovered wasn't hidden in any underground room. It was the relationship we rebuilt through honesty, hard work, and the kind of love that's tough enough to let people learn from their mistakes. Robert's final gift to us wasn't money at all. It was the chance to become people worthy of inheriting not just wealth, but wisdom.